Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much for having me here and allowing to share a word with you. Thank you to you all for being willing to listen, and thank you to John and Zelina for giving me a platform. First, I guess I'll start with sharing a bit about who I am. I believe we've got a photo that can come up. That's my fiancée. I just got engaged recently, which is super exciting. And this is a photo of us at a footy game. We're both big footy supporters, but unfortunately we go for two opposite teams, which is fun. And we're getting married soon, which is very exciting. I'm looking forward to that. And I go to Bible college, so I study at Melbourne School of Theology, doing a Bachelor of Ministry. And we wish to go in the near future to be missionaries. So that's a bit about me. That's who I am. I'm new to this. I'm just sort of learning how to preach. But believe it or not, this is not the first time that I've preached with a translator. I'll give you that fun and chaotic story. So my fiancée, who you can still see, she grew up in a small country in Africa called Malawi, which you can see just here. It's a very poor country, very small. And her parents were missionaries. They went there to set up an audiology clinic. And earlier this year, we travelled there to go visit the country. And whilst we were there, we spent some time in some of the villages. You can see this photo. And we would play soccer with them. It was lots of fun. One village we went to had about 500 people in it. And only a couple of them could speak English. So I really could not understand what they were saying. They couldn't understand what I was saying, a bit like this. And I played soccer with the kids at the village in about 45-degree heat. So I was sweating and dripping, which was lots of fun. Then somehow some of the people in the village learnt that I go to Bible college. So they came up to me and asked if I could give a 30-minute sermon in 5 minutes. So I had 5 minutes to prepare a 30-minute sermon. So I was very nervous. I didn't have anything prepared, and it was not very good. But I promised today will be better. I've luckily had more than 5 minutes to prepare. So, yeah, fingers crossed we'll do better today. So we're looking at Nehemiah 5 today. It's a beautiful passage of scripture, one that we probably wouldn't traditionally look at in much depth, but I think it's really got some amazing things that we can learn in it. It's a story of radical generosity and a story of God's righteousness brought to the people. And for a bit of a rundown of what's going on so far in Nehemiah, the people are living under a Persian government. They're living under foreign rule, and this is disgraceful to the people. They are living under embarrassment. They are supposed to be living in the promised lands. And for Israel, the promised lands is a symbol of God's covenant, of his goodness to them. And when Nehemiah hears of this in the beginning of Nehemiah, he prays and he mourns for days. He turns to God for help. We read that in Nehemiah 1. And then he goes to the king for permission, for help. He turns to the king to go and rebuild these walls. And luckily the king grants him an escort, and they go and begin to build the wall. And the people, they band together to do the work that God has called them to. And as a reader, we see that it's going amazingly well. We see in brilliant detail in chapter 3 of how well this is being built. This wall is being constructed at rapid pace. In fact, it's chapter 3 is written in such fine detail that in preparation for today, I read a commentary and it said, and I quote, that chapter 3 is a dull and colourless expression of tasks. It's so detailed I could stand here and give you the whole sermon about what it talks about. You see 38 different workers named, each given a task and where they worked and what they did. So the people are working enthusiastically and the people are working for God. We see this because the sheep gate opens and closes chapter 3. We see them talk about how they built the sheep gate at the start and the end of chapter 3. This seems unimportant. It seems like a weird thing to talk about. But the sheep gate was the spot where the animals were brought in for sacrifice. It was really, really important, and it means that they were treating this wall for God. We read this passage and we're full of hope. As a reader, we are full of hope. It looks like we're going to see Jerusalem restored perfectly, without a flaw. But then we see in chapter 4 that opposition arises. Sanballat and Tobiah, two people we're introduced to in chapter 4, are deeply angry that this wall is being built. And Nehemiah recognizes the severity of this threat that they pose, and he steps into action. He's a great leader. See, if anyone's going to complete this wall, it'll be him. He's clearly got a knack for this type of leadership. And he encourages the people to turn to God in prayer. But he also encourages people to turn to God through preparation. They pray day and night, and they put armor on. They clothe themselves in God's protection. They get ready and they get vigilant for this opposition they face. And we read in Nehemiah so far something that is a great example and of great importance to our lives today. Prayer and preparation is key for us. And this idea is reflected throughout the New Testament continually. Significantly through places like Ephesians 6:10-20, where Paul calls us to put on the armor of God, just like Nehemiah called his people. And it's a powerful message with a beautiful application. See, we live in a world full of violence and growing hostility towards Christians. We're blessed to live in Australia. We've got an amazing freedom. But the truth is, most of the world doesn't live with this much religious freedom. In fact, 360 million Christians around the world live under high to very high or extreme levels of persecution for Christians. We're very lucky to live in Australia. And these chapters of Nehemiah are super, super relevant. But our passage today is what follows, Nehemiah 5. And I think it's even potentially a more beautiful passage for us today. And I think we need it now more than we've ever needed it. See, everything leading up to Nehemiah 5 is hopeful. Yes, there are challenges, but God is protecting them. They have done the right thing and they're leaning into God. So in Nehemiah 5:1, we read that now the men and their wives raised a great outcry against their Jewish brothers. Something has gone wrong. They are mad at their people. There is obviously something disastrous happening. And there's a famine. A great famine has struck the land. In verses 2 and 4, we see how extreme this famine is. But verse 5 is by far the most explicit. We see in Nehemiah 5:5 that they were selling their own people to slavery. They were selling their children into slavery. It says, some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we are powerless because our fields and our vineyards belong to others. It's a graphic and devastating event. In fact, the original Hebrew here implies something we don't even get in the English or the Mandarin. But the people likely were even, the children sold into slavery were likely even forced into some forms of sexual slavery. So it's really a graphic thing going on. And what they're doing is evil in the eyes of God. In Leviticus 25:35 to 39, we see that the Israelites are called to not sell their children as slaves. And they're told not to charge interest against their brothers and sisters. But this is exactly what they're doing here. It's specifically against the law that God has given them. And we see in Nehemiah 5:6, Nehemiah's response. See, up to this chapter, the people are following God, but now they result to what we've seen. And Nehemiah 5:6, it says, when I heard their outcry and these charges, I was very angry. In fact, the Hebrew word here that Nehemiah uses to say he's very angry is the same word we see throughout the Old Testament to describe God's wrath against his people. He's furious. He's burning hot in his anger. See, as Christians, we sometimes feel like we're not allowed to be angry. But I would argue that we are. God is continually described as angry. Luckily, he's described as slow to anger. But sometimes anger is the right result to injustice. It's the correct response to evil, to be upset and angry about it. But at the same time, we have to balance. In our anger, we're not allowed to sin. So that's something that we have to wrestle with. And that's something that we see Nehemiah wrestle with. His response takes time. He has to evaluate the right response. In Nehemiah 5:7, we see that he pondered them in his mind. He spent time to pray and decide what to do. Nehemiah must be careful in his response. The task of building the wall that God has called them to is at risk. And I wonder if you too have had an important task interrupted. I'm reminded here of a video I watched during COVID where a politician was recording an interview live on air through Zoom. And in the background we see one of their children run in, followed a couple of seconds later by a baby. Then the nanny comes running in, looking distraught and afraid. And the politician realizes that what's going on in the background, and she plays it off well. She plays it off as a joke. And she's careful about it. She does well. And Nehemiah here is also careful. How is he to respond to this action? If his response is too extreme, the people might not listen. They might brush off the punishment. But if his response is too easy, the sin will continue. So, Nehemiah's response, we see he first tasks the nobles and rulers. He gets the official people together and he gets angry at them. He tells them essentially that they are using their Jewish brothers as pawnbrokers. He's taking advantage. They are taking advantage of them. They are exploiting their own people. This step for Nehemiah would have taken guts. He's tackling the big people. He stands up to those in charge and confronts them of where they are exploiting their own people. And he warns them to walk in fear of God. Nehemiah 5:9 says, "So I continued, what you are doing is not right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of our God to avoid the reproach of our Gentile enemies?" These people are not following God, and because of that, they should fear the punishment. And we're given a similar warning in the New Testament. Matthew 12:36 warns us that there's a judgment day that we will all face. And Revelation 20:12 says that we will one day be judged according to our works. Nehemiah's cry to walk in fear or in respect of God applies to us today. But this is not the only thing that Nehemiah is mad about, because they aren't living up to the Old Testament law. They're bringing their people to shame. See, God gave the Israelites and these people the law so that they can stand out, so they can be an image of God's goodness. The law enables others to see the goodness of the shepherd through the behavior of the sheep. And by breaking these laws, the Israelites are doing the opposite. They're bringing shame upon themselves. And then in verse 10, we see Nehemiah portrays the marks of a true leader. He admits his own flaws. He tells them that we need to stop lending grain and stop charging interest. He is among the people who are breaking the law God gave them. But he is a good leader, and he admits his flaws. And his response is clear and immediate. He abolishes the interest that he is owed. He negates the money that people are supposed to give him. And he expects the others to follow suit. And we're forgiven in a similar way. We see in Matthew 18 the parable of the unforgiving servant. We're told that unless we forgive our brothers and sisters, that God won't forgive us. It's a scary parable and a strong warning. But we must forgive just like Nehemiah forgave people. And then again in Nehemiah 5:11, Nehemiah again repeats that the debts have to be returned. When people needed food, they took others' farms. And when people needed wine, they took their vineyards. And when people needed olive oil, they took their olive orchards. People have been stealing from each other, and Nehemiah instructs people to give it back. See, because the crime that's occurring is whilst the majority grow poor, a few are growing rich, exploiting those who don't have a voice. They're exploiting the vulnerable, and they're exploiting their own brothers and sisters. In verse 12, we see that Nehemiah forces the priests to listen to himself. The priests are to uphold the ethics of the people. So he summons them and he makes them take an oath. This oath, it's stronger than a promise. We don't really have oaths in Australian society. I'm not sure about what it's like for you guys. But this oath, it's binding. They commit to an oath to ensure that no exploitation occurs. They're committed to this. And in verse 13, we see something odd. It's a bit confusing what's going on here. He shakes out the folds of his robe and says, "In this way may God shake out their houses and possessions to anyone who does not keep this promise. So may such a person be shaken out and emptied." See, Nehemiah is saying that if the people do not do what they said they will, if they do not follow this oath they've committed, that God will shake them out. This doesn't make much sense to us, or to me at least when I read it. But in Nehemiah's day, people stored their valuable possessions in their robes. They would keep their wallet and their passport and anything else they couldn't lose on them at all times. See, Nehemiah is saying that if these people do not listen to this and follow this oath they have given, God will shake them out of their possessions. Essentially, if they continue to exploit their own people, God will start exploiting them. They've made a promise before God, and if they break it, they'll be punished. An act of shaking out your robe becomes common. We see it again in Scripture. In Acts 18:6, we see that Paul tells the Jews, he shook out his own clothes in protest to them. He tells them their blood is on their own hands. Their judgment is their own fault. It's a really cool link. I really enjoyed seeing that. But Nehemiah is more than just a passage of weird sayings and a weird oath about shaking out your clothes. It's a passage of radical generosity. It's a demonstration of what our attitude must be in response to injustice. We must be the one who listens to Nehemiah and follows suit in our response. See, globally, almost 10% of the world's population lives in extreme poverty. That's 719 million people. And even within Melbourne, the Victorian Council of Social Services says that 13% of Victorians live in significant economic disadvantage. So how do we respond to this as Christians? Well, I mentioned before that I currently go to Bible college. And my favourite lecturer actually retired a couple of weeks ago. He was great. He was a brilliantly smart man. He was actually recognised worldwide for his writings and his books that he'd published, and he'd actually edited and contributed to some of the most academic commentaries that are currently available. This man is a superstar in the field. But what I think he was most known for was his honesty and his humility in his teaching style. He taught us a class on Luke, and we spent 15 weeks going through Luke slowly and in immense detail, like hours on verses. It was ridiculous. And one of the assignments we were given was to write an assignment on Luke's theology of wealth. And upon reading our assignments, he came back to us and shared in class that what we had written had deeply touched him. He was about to retire. He's in his 80s, and he was looking forward to it for probably many, many years. But he was struggling with the ethics of having significant wealth to be able to retire as a Christian. And I was taken back by this. He shared how he was struggling to justify spending $50 on a shirt when there are people around even his own streets that are living in poverty and can't afford their next meal. This took me back. It really shook me up when I heard it. And I have not looked at wealth the same way since. But I can't help but feel that maybe we, as people who live in the West, with our great economic security, are the ones that are exploiting the minority world. The New Testament is a collage of people who give up their possessions for those in need. It happens continually. And in Matthew 25:31-46, we see a profound passage. Here we see that when we feed the hungry, when we clothe the naked, when we give water to the thirsty, we are not just serving those who need our help, but we're serving Jesus. I encourage you to go read that passage when you get home. It's really touching. Because when we serve those who are in need, we are serving Jesus. And it's our mission as Christians to serve those in need. I don't know if my lecturer went and bought $50 t-shirts, but he changed the way that me and the rest of our class viewed wealth. And again, in Luke 18, verses 18 to 30, we see another profound teaching. A man comes to Jesus. He's a righteous man. And he asks, "Good teacher, how must I inherit eternal life?" He's tried so hard to follow the law, but he lacks one thing. He is wealthy, but he is not generous. It's important here to make the distinction that the Bible does not think of money as sinful. It's not a sin to be wealthy, and it's not idolized. It's not good to be poor. The issue is the love of money, not money itself. The issue is the lack of generosity. The issue is that this man loves money, and that Jesus tells him that he lacks one thing. God calls him to be generous and to distribute his wealth to those who have none. And then in verse 25, he gives him a strong warning. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God. The Bible does not look fondly upon those who do not give with a generous heart. Luckily, the very next verse gives us a demonstration that God can forgive people even in their lack of generosity. But Nehemiah was furious when he heard that the people were not being generous. And we should be furious too. Our response to injustice as Christians should be empathy and anger. We need to listen to the cries of the people who are suffering and are crying out for help. So I want to encourage you, next time you walk past someone who's in need, maybe you're in the city and you walk past a homeless person, I encourage you to stop and be generous and interact with them. As Christians, we're called to be generous. And I want to thank you for being generous in your tithes. I saw that you did that at the start. I thought that was great. But it's not enough for us to give a strict 10% and not give any more. We should be excited, generous, and loving. We should hear the cries of the people, and our response should be the same as Nehemiah's. We should be frustrated by injustice. It is not a sin to be upset and angry with the actions of the people who have forced innocent people into poverty. But in our anger, we must not sin. We must be loving and generous. Just as Nehemiah was radically generous and told everyone to give back everything they had, we should be too. When he learns that the people are living in injustice, his response is radical. He demands that justice be restored, even when it's challenging. He commands the people to sell their property to pay for the debts of other people. But most importantly, he practices what he preaches, and he does it himself. He calls out the flaws in his own behavior and corrects them. So how, as Christians, are we responding to injustice? Are we the type of person that when we see a homeless person, we'll sit down, maybe pray for them, buy them something to eat? Are we the type of people who pray for the millions of people every day who can't afford their next meal? Are we people who are willing to sell our possessions for those who are in need? And don't get me wrong, I'm not perfect at this. I'm learning just as much as you all are. But I just want to encourage you. to be generous. See, because there's a quote I've got from the Australian Institute that the average Australian spends almost $2,000 yearly on items that go unused. We live in a disastrous spending culture. We have an abundance of things that we don't need, and we continue to buy things that we don't use. So maybe as a church, it's time for us to band together and commit to cutting back this useless spending. If we were all to cut back by this number, by $1,000, which sounds like a lot, but if it's unused, maybe it's not that important. We could transform lives. Every person in this chair, sitting down in these chairs, could transform someone's life. We could make a difference in the lives of real people. So I want to encourage you, maybe next time you're buying something that you don't know if it's necessary, to instead consider giving that money to people who need it. Nehemiah calls us into radical generosity. And being a Christian is supposed to be radical. It's a beautiful and simple message, but it's supposed to be radical. That is why it's such a big deal when the image of the Israelites are damaged, because their image is supposed to be different. They are supposed to be people of love, of God's justice. And the same is true for us now. We are called to be people who are known for our love. So I just want to encourage you and plead with you that we be people who are generous. I'm not asking you to sell your kidneys or sell your left shoe or your clothes, but maybe next time that you're buying a coffee, get a small and give that 50 cents. Keep a jar. When that jar fills up, give it to the homeless person. I don't know. But take simple steps that move us towards this image of generosity. Because are we generous when we can be? Do we live differently to the people of this world? Because when Nehemiah hears the cries of his people, he responds. Are we hearing the cries of our people? Are we radically generous? We should be people of radical generosity. The Christian message, again, it's a radical one. And our actions and our behavior should be distinct from the world around us. Our commitment to following Jesus is supposed to make our behavior radically different. In Acts 22:45, we see a radical image of the early church. It says, and they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. They sold their possessions to those who needed it. So how do we get back to this? As Nehemiah calls his people into radical generosity, I want to encourage you to pay attention to where you can be generous. The Christian message is a radical one, and our behavior should be a radical one. So how can we be radical in our generosity? Thank you. That's everything I had.